All right, now it's time to discuss one of life's greatest needs and pleasures, food. Now, as much as we love and need food, it's fair to say putting it on the table has recently become a much bigger challenge for many Australians, with prices surging in the last few years. But with Australia's inflation rate seemingly back under control, does that mean grocery prices are finally steady again? Well, to help us find out, I'm pleased to say we're joined by Rabobank senior food analyst Michael Harvey. G'day, Michael. Welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for jumping on, Michael. Looking forward to this one because I love food. But before we jump into food prices and what you're seeing from Rabobank's point of view, do you have a savings tip for us?
I do, and I'll stick to my domain of expertise and think about it from a food consumption lens. Look, I've got two young kids that have got lots of after school activities, whether it's dance classes and netball training, all that sort of stuff. So we do spend a bit of time on meal preparation for the week, and it's really just about trying to reduce wastage, right? So if you're buying a tub of cream for one meal, you want to try and use the rest of it because that's quite expensive, and it's the same with fresh produce and things like that. So there's probably nothing earth shattering in terms of what we try and do, but it's really around a well-prepared meal plan for the week and trying to use up all the stuff that you're buying and reduce waste because, yeah, it's expensive, the average food basket these days.
Absolutely. Yeah, meal prepping is certainly, it's one of those things I know I should be doing and I want to be doing it, but for some reason I just can't find myself ever finding the time to just block out a couple of hours and just make a whole bunch of meals in bulk. But yeah, I can imagine it'd be pretty rewarding, savings you some time down the track, at the end of the day when you're exhausted after work and you can't be bothered cooking something. You go, oh, that's right, I made a whole batch of meals on the weekend. Now, getting to the main topic here, grocery prices. Just off the top, what's happening with grocery prices at the moment? As I sort of mentioned, with inflation back within target now, does that mean grocery prices are steady again?
They are. If you look, and we lean into the ABS quarterly inflation data more than anything to have a really good look at what's going on inside the food market and the food basket. And if you want to put a positive lens on it, you could certainly suggest that, food inflation it's a much more normal pricing environment. So if you looked at the most recent results, which was the June quarter data, you had food inflation in grocery at 3%. Year on year, that was slightly down from the previous quarter, and it was less than 3% in the out-of-home categories. So that is much more aligned to the long-term trend around what food inflation runs at. So that's the positive lens to that. But I mean, clearly, context is important, right? Because the historical trend here is we're coming to the very end of a very major spike in food prices across everything. So you can put a positive lens on that. It's a more normal environment at the moment, but historical context is important to consider around what that actually means for consumers and households here in Australia.
Yeah, just broadly, Michael, what food categories are seeing the biggest price shocks? I think eggs is the hot topic, coffee as well from Colombia, and what's leading to these sort of price shocks?
Yeah, and that's why you can look at the headline number and think it's not a bad story, but you always look inside the basket and it's quite mixed. I mean, and this is what would frustrate consumers, I guess, is that there was only three categories where you're seeing deflation of all the categories that the ABS provide decent data on. So that just shows you, prices aren't coming down much at all. And even then, when you're looking at the deflation story, the first thing you need to do is compare it to what was happening this time last year. So you've got one of the categories where there was deflation was in oils and fats. But over the last couple of years, that's been one category where you've seen some of the highest price rises because one of higher cooking oil prices like olive oil pricing, but even butter pricing. So that's the story. But when you think about the broader result in the most recent quarterly data, I mean, eggs was the outlier. That's 20% or close to 20% year on year in terms of egg pricing in the June quarter. But there was also snacking and confectionery was running at over 5.5%. So that's still quite high after a period of sustained inflation because that's a story of high cocoa prices in the global market. Fresh produce is always volatile, but it was running at just over 4.6% to be exact. So that's always, that's quite high as well. And then you had, lamb pricing, but that was really on the back of a very weak comparable this time last year. Yeah. So, but the eggs, snacking because of confectionery and even coffee, which comes through in the beverage category, were the ones that were, posting higher than average inflation rate.
Now, Michael, on our website, Savings.com.au, we actually have a bit of a bespoke grocery price index of our own, which is the methodology is probably not absolutely watertight. It's pretty simple. We just basically, at the same time of the month, we have a quick snapshot of prices on Coles and then prices on Woolies, and then we've kept a log of it over the last couple of years or so. But just looking at what we found for July, there were some interesting products that had risen in price, but also some falls as well. Just wondering if you could explain perhaps why we'd see something like the price of a washed 2 kilo bag of potatoes bouncing around. We saw that one jump up from like $4 to $7.90 almost in a month. Coffee and chocolate, I guess that's sort of all to do with all the cocoa stuff. So we probably don't need to go into that. But then also some of the falls that we saw is onions seem to be down quite a bit, about 22% on July last year. Salmon prices look like they're down about 12%. So yeah, can you just explain perhaps some of these movements?
Yeah, and let me digress for one moment because it speaks to that story, right? When you think about food pricing over the last couple of years, I mean, at the end of the day, whatever way you want to calculate it, but one of the things that I do is look at like a compound inflation rate since 2022, because that was really the trigger around the spike in food inflation, which peaked in 2022 and then has taken a long time to normalise. And it comes down to what drives higher food prices over that period of time. But if you just looked at the ABS data and looked at what that food basket has done over that period of time since the June quarter in 2022 to now, the food and beverage basket's close to 25% higher year on across the board, and then you break it down by category. But it's the same in out of home when you're thinking about restaurant meals or takeaway meals. So you're talking about food prices being at least 20% or more higher than what they were a couple of years ago, and then why have we had this spike in food prices over that period of time? And there's a few things to think about. I mean, one, there's been some global events which had a profound impact on food and energy markets, which feeds through into commodity prices, which feeds through into food prices, right? And there's a couple of outliers at the moment that are still causing grief for consumers, and cocoa's one, coffee's one. But over the last couple of years, there's a few other commodities like dairy commodity pricing, orange juice concentrate, a whole range of different commodities where you get a spike in the global price for that commodity that puts upward pressure on the consumer foods price, because that's the core component of the food product. And that comes through a lot in packaged foods, the way we think about it, whether it's cereal products or biscuits and things like that. So it's commodity price spikes putting upward pressure on consumer prices. But the other one, which speaks to some of the things you talked about, is you get localized events as well. And we've had a couple of them over the last couple of years where you get unfavorable seasonal conditions. You can get major weather events, whether it's flooding or droughts, which just have a profound impact on production of fresh produce, whether it's onions and lettuce and all those sorts of things. And when you get supply shocks locally, that really does spike prices for fresh produce. Conversely, when you have better growing conditions, you get more normalised pricing environment. So whenever you're looking at the fresh produce category, always taking into consideration, well, what was happening this time last year, but what are growing conditions what are they right now? And right now, growing conditions aren't too bad for winter because we've had some decent rainfall, which is much needed for a lot of ag sectors. But we haven't had major flooding events everywhere, which often can cause quite significant problems. So it's always a story around, are there global events putting upward pressure on the food system, or is it a localized weather event impacting supply availability?
For sure. Now, I'm glad you mentioned world events because there's a couple of things that I want to mention. I was listening to your podcast actually about China and the impact on the dairy industry. And then as well as that, I think Australia's agreed to start importing some US beef. What sort of impact do you see, the US and China are two of the world's largest economies. How do you see this affecting prices here with regards to dairy and beef?
Yeah, and that's where, so when you think about global markets, I mean, you go back to, don't want to look back too far, but I mean, 2022 was that price spike in commodity markets, which was the trigger for a lot of this food inflation we're talking about. I mean, that was on the back of the war in Ukraine, triggering an energy and food supply shock to the global market. Things have settled down since then, but we know that in the background there are still geopolitical conflicts. There's still some supply chain bottlenecks at time, all those sort of events that have an impact on the food ecosystem. But then you just get into fundamentals in commodity markets, and that can come down to supply and demand in global markets. And China has a big role in a lot of commodity markets because of the size of their influence in the balance of the global market. So when China is short of commodity and they start buying from a global market in a big way, that can drive commodity prices high, and that can trigger higher food prices. And conversely, it goes the other way when they've had a weaker environment, which they have more recently. But it's not just China. I mean, it's what's going on with supply and demand in South America, in the Northern Hemisphere, even in this part of the world. So you're always looking at global markets around shocks to the global market because of geopolitical issues or things like that, but also just major swings in the fundamentals in the global market, which obviously put upward or downward pressure on pricing. And that's why most commodity prices are lower at the moment, but there's those outliers, and we've talked about a couple of them already. But the other one that we haven't sort of really talked about is you've got very high global butter prices at the moment, which would mean that there could be more upward in prices coming through on things like butter at the consumer shelf as well. So yeah, that's the way we think about it. And yeah, as I said, China plays a big role because they're a big buyer of commodities in a lot of sectors.
Now, Michael, throughout the cost of living crisis, which is arguably still ongoing at the moment, there was a lot of accusations thrown at the major supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, of price gouging. Because I guess naturally, when you're just at the consumer level and you're paying really high prices for groceries, it's a pretty simple, person to blame and just think, it's Coles and Woolies jacking up their prices, and maybe there's not enough consideration for all these supply chain impacts. So I just wanted to know, I was curious to know what your thoughts were on that, and whether you think those claims of price gouging stand up.
Yeah, and first recognising, and that's what's been challenging for households, is it's been a significant income squeeze for Aussie households at a time when inflation has been very high, and that's why you're seeing such profound shifts in the way consumers and Aussie households buy their food. And we can talk about that maybe if you want, but absolutely. We looked at the last couple of years, and you can do this in terms of looking at margin performance across the supply chain or the value chain and the profit pool. And I certainly see evidence enough to suggest that there was a significant margin squeeze downstream. And when I talk about downstream post-farm gate, because of what happened in all this was that you had a spike in commodity prices, but that was overlaid with a jump in the cost of producing food, not just on farm, but it was there in terms of fuel prices rose, there was labour availability shortages, fertiliser prices jumped dramatically, interest rates moved higher, so the cost of producing food on farm spiked. But there was also significant cost inflation downstream in food manufacturing and food retailing, starting at, conversion costs or processing costs, the cost of packaging, the cost of distribution, wage inflation came through. And so you can look at profitability of food companies over the last couple of years, and you would have seen quite a uniform reduction in margin performance. And it's the same for some of the retailers. When you think about EBIT performance of food companies or the retailers, they took a hit through the pandemic and through the spike in the cost of producing food and distributing it. They're in recovery mode, but there's evidence to suggest that they're not back to sort of pre-COVID levels. So that's why it comes back to that story. This was a systematic increase in the cost of production across the food ecosystem, and that's why consumers are paying a lot more for food. And there's a lot of nuance to that story around why we're all paying a lot more for our food basket.
It isn't something that's really prevalent in this debate. I think people see it in sort of black and white terms as seeing them handing over more money but getting less in their grocery bag. Just finally, Michael, a bit of a sort of philosophical one. Now, you mentioned meal prep at the start of the pod. It's a bit of an admin upkeep on a Sunday afternoon or whatever. If you could eat a pill that had all of your nutritional needs and kept you satiated, would you do it, or do you love food too much?
Well, personally, I love food too much, and I actually like cooking. So no, I don't mind preparing a lot. I probably do. My wife's not listening. Prepare more meals in our family than her, which is fine. I do like doing it. So yeah, I don't mind going through the meal preparation process. But I think that just speaking to, that's why what we do see is clearly you've got those ongoing shifts in how consumers purchase and prepare food. And the most obvious one is consumers just stop spending out as much. So they don't eat out as much as they did in the past. And when they do eat out, they may be trading down from a full service restaurant to a more fast casual setting. That's a fairly common trend. But inside the home, they are trading down, and that can be buying private label more than branded products, or they're buying on discount or promotion, or they're buying in bulk. They're doing more smaller basket size shopping. They're shopping at the discounters like Aldi more regularly, and that is a common trend you're seeing coming through. Like Aldi's performing really well over the last couple of years. So there's all those purchasing decisions that consumers make. But at the other end of that, I mean, what you do have is a significant response from food companies and retailers trying to, recognizing that we're all value conscious consumers at the moment, right? So they're trying to do that in terms of product innovation and product offering. And that can mean, they do, you might have read about shrinkflation is one of the levers that can get pulled. But I mean, it is focusing on trying to find a value proposition where, consumers are getting value out of what they're buying in their meal preparation. So there is a lot of investment and focus on that at the moment.
A very mature answer to what was quite a strange left field question there from Harrison. Michael Harvey, really appreciated your time on the Savings Tip Jar podcast. Thanks so much for sharing all those great insights.
My pleasure. Great to have you. And it's a fascinating space at the moment. So always happy to talk about food markets.
Absolutely. Yep.
Absolutely. Now I'm hungry.